Imagine the cold granite under your fingertips. 3,000 feet of empty air beneath the soles of your climbing shoes. There are no ropes, no safety nets. The wind is howling, but inside your mind, there is absolute, deafening silence. At this exact moment, you are not thinking about your mortgage. You are not thinking about what you had for breakfast. You aren't even thinking about the next handhold. In fact, you are not there at all. The person you call I has completely vanished. The climber and the mountain have become one continuous breathing organism. Psychologists call this the flow state, the zone. It is the absolute pinnacle of human performance. But to get there, the ego had to die. Now, hold on to that feeling of complete emptiness, and let's travel backwards. 2,500 years ago, the banks of the Namo River. The air is thick, humid. A man sits beneath the sprawling branches of a Bodhi tree. He isn't climbing a mountain, he isn't performing a complex brain surgery or improvising a jazz masterpiece. He is perfectly still. But internally, he is navigating the exact same psychological territory as that extreme athlete. Siddhartha Gautama is fighting a war against Mara, the ultimate personification of the inner critic, the ego, the survival instinct that constantly screams, "I am here, protect me." But Siddhartha doesn't fight by adding more weapons to his arsenal. He wins by dropping everything. He enters what is known as Sunyata, the void, Jit Wang, the empty mind. He achieves the ultimate breakthrough not by trying to acquire a new state of mind, but by radically subtracting the self. This brings us to a strange, almost uncomfortable realization. We are conditioned by society to believe that to reach our highest potential, to unlock genius, we need more knowledge, more life hacks, more focus, more identity. But what if the ultimate state of human productivity and profound realization isn't about adding more to our brains? What if the secret is purely in the subtraction? Today, we are going to map the exact coordinates where ancient Buddhist cosmology intersects with quantum mechanics and modern neuroscience. We are going to deconstruct the architecture of emptiness. When modern neuroscientists put master meditators into fMRI machines, they expect to see brains lighting up like fireworks. Instead, they find something terrifyingly beautiful: a deliberate blackout. A network in the brain known as the default mode network, the exact neurological address where your ego, your anxiety, and your sense of self live, completely powers down. Scientists call it transient hypofrontality. The prefrontal cortex, the overthinking, analyzing CEO of your brain, simply goes offline. You are biologically entering the void. It makes me wonder, though, and I've been thinking about this a lot lately. If our greatest moments of genius, our highest peaks of performance, only happen when our sense of I completely disappears, then who is actually doing the work? If you are not there when the masterpiece is created, who created it? I haven't quite found a satisfying answer to that paradox myself. Is it the universe acting through us? Or is the I just a biological illusion we only need when we are surviving, not when we are thriving? But the rabbit hole goes much deeper than just brain chemistry. Because if the human mind operates at its absolute maximum capacity in a state of emptiness, how does that mirror the universe itself? In quantum physics, we look at the vacuum of space and realize it is not empty. Zero-point energy tells us that the vacuum is a boiling sea of infinite potential. Emptiness is not a dead end. It is the womb of creation. This is exactly what the ancient texts meant when they stated, "Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form." Jit Wang is not a state of nothingness. It is a state of no-thingness. When the rigid ego collapses, you don't become nothing. You become entangled with everything. The question isn't whether you can reach this state. The biology is already built into you. The universe operates on these very laws. The real question is whether you are willing to let go of the one thing holding you back from absolute flow. Are you willing to let go of yourself? The next time you sit down to create, to work, or simply to exist, remember the climber on the wall and the ascetic under the tree. The masterpiece isn't waiting for you to find it. It's waiting for you to get out of the way. Picture the deep jungle of India 2.5 millennia ago. The moon is hidden. The air is heavy with that suffocating humidity that precedes a storm. A man named Siddhartha Gautama sits motionless beneath the sprawling roots of a Bodhi tree. According to the ancient myths, this is the night he is attacked by a terrifying entity named Mara. The texts describe Mara commanding armies of demons, hurling storms of fire, and conjuring seductive illusions to break Siddhartha's concentration. But let's strip away the mythology for a moment. Let's look at the neurological architecture of what was actually happening inside his skull. Mara wasn't a monster with horns hiding in the jungle. Mara is the exact same voice you hear in your own head when you're about to take a massive risk, step onto a stage, or try to create something original. I have to admit, this is a very visceral experience for me. The first few times I seriously tried to sit in absolute silence and just observe my own mind, it was a complete disaster. My personal Mara was deafening. It threw every past embarrassment, every insecurity, and every anxiety about the future right against the inside of my forehead. It was exhausting. I'm quite certain that anyone who has ever tried to simply be still has slammed into that exact same wall of mental noise. But Siddhartha didn't fight the noise. If you fight the ego, you are just using the ego to fight itself. Instead, he simply observed it. He watched the fear, the desire, and the survival instinct until they dissolved. He realized there was nothing permanent there to be attacked. This is the psychological breakthrough of anatta, non-self, and realizing anatta is the gateway that leads directly into sunyata, emptiness. When most people hear the word emptiness, they imagine a dark, depressing void. They think of nihilism, a state where nothing matters and you just sit staring at a wall devoid of emotion. But that is a tragic mistranslation of the ancient wisdom. Sunyata is not a black hole. It is not an empty room. Think of it more like a room that has finally been cleared of all the heavy, useless furniture you've been hoarding your entire life. Now there's space to actually move, space to dance. Emptiness is simply the absence of a rigid, defensive ego. If I'm going to be completely direct here, I think the modern Western self-improvement industry has this entirely backwards. We are so obsessed with building our identity, finding our true self, and adding more and more labels to who we are. I'm fairly convinced that trying to build a stronger ego is the exact reason our society is so chronically burned out. The constant maintenance of the self is exhausting. But, of course, that might just be my perspective based on how I view the contrast between these two philosophies. How did the Buddha actually reach this state? He didn't just stumble into it. He used a very specific, systematic technology of the mind known as the jhanas. The jhanas are states of meditative absorption. When you read the ancient Pali Canon, the descriptions of the jhanas aren't religious prayers. They are a rigorous, step-by-step blueprint for what modern psychology now calls the flow state. Stage by stage, you deliberately turn off sensory distractions. Then, you shut down the analytical, narrating mind. Finally, you dissolve the concept of the doer. There is only the doing. I am exploring this from the perspective of a researcher and a philosopher bridging these worlds, but I recognize my own limitations here. I know there are seasoned practitioners and scholars listening to this who have accessed these deeper states of jhana through decades of retreat. I would actually be fascinated to know how you would articulate that subtle shift from the first jhana to the second jhana in your own direct experience, because I know theoretical knowledge can only take us so far. To give this the academic weight it deserves, we can look straight at the textual evidence. The Heart Sutra, one of the most profound texts in Mahayana Buddhism, contains perhaps the most famous and cryptic formula in human history. Form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. It means that the things we think are solid, permanent, and independent, our bodies, our thoughts, our identities, are actually fluid, entirely dependent on conditions, and constantly changing. Nothing exists in isolation. Whenever I think about that specific line, I can't help but wonder, if everything we consider real is actually empty of a permanent self, then what exactly is experiencing reality right now? If the I is just an illusion created by the brain, who is the one listening to this sentence? It's a paradox that constantly shifts the ground beneath my feet. This realization wasn't isolated to ancient India. As this psychological technology moved across the continent, it evolved, but the core mechanism remained identical. In Japan, the samurai adapted this exact concept into mushin, no mind. A master swordsman cannot think about his technique, his fear of death, or his desire to win. The moment he thinks, he introduces cognitive friction, and he dies. He must enter the void. He doesn't swing the sword swings itself. In China, the Taoists conceptualized this as Wu Wei, effortless action, doing by not doing. It is the art of aligning so perfectly with the natural currents of reality that the friction of the ego completely vanishes. It all points to the same universal truth. Peak performance and profound clarity require the total surrender of the self. If you had to capture that feeling of total surrender, of completely letting go of control to operate at your absolute highest level, what is one word that describes that for you? For me, the word is weightless. I'm incredibly curious what word instinctively comes to your mind. For thousands of years, these ancient texts provided the philosophical map and the mental exercises to reach this state. But for a long time, the modern scientific world dismissed it as mystical poetry, until quite recently, until we invented machines powerful enough to peer inside a living, beating human brain. And what modern neuroscientists discovered when they went looking for the biological equivalent of Mara, the exact physical location of the ego, changes absolutely everything. We left the ancient jungle, the myth, and the Bodhi tree. Now, let's step into a sterile, brightly lit laboratory. For decades, Western science looked at these profound states of absolute emptiness as nothing more than subjective, religious experiences. You couldn't weigh them. You couldn't measure them. They were dismissed as mystical poetry. Until a psychologist named Dr. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi started studying the most elite performers on the planet. He wasn't studying monks in caves. He was studying chess grandmasters, Olympic athletes, surgeons, and world-class jazz musicians. He discovered they all entered a highly specific psychological zone where they performed at levels that seemed almost superhuman. He called it the flow state. When he documented the exact parameters of flow, it was like reading a ghost from the past. Complete loss of self-consciousness, a distortion of time where 6 hours feel like 6 seconds, the total merging of action and awareness. He was, word for word, describing the ancient Buddhist jhanas. This is a direct experience I've had myself when I'm deeply immersed in writing or researching. I look up, the sun has gone down, and I don't even remember eating, drinking, or breathing. I completely forgot that I existed for a few hours. I'm sure many of you have experienced this kind of intense time warp in your own lives, whether you were coding, painting, or even driving on an empty highway. It's a fascinating, almost eerie moment when you return to your body. But what is actually happening inside the dark chamber of the skull when the self vanishes? To find out, researchers at Yale University, led by Dr. Judson Brewer, put highly experienced master meditators into fMRI scanners. They wanted to catch the ego in real time. What they found completely shattered the modern assumption that more brain power equals better results. They isolated a very specific circuit in the brain called the default mode network, or the DMN. Whenever you were worrying about the future, regretting the past, obsessing over how people perceive you, or engaging in negative self-talk, your DMN is lighting up like a Christmas tree. The DMN is the neurological address of the ego. It is the biological, physical manifestation of Mara. But when these master meditators entered the state of deep emptiness, the DMN went dark. They didn't just calm the ego, they literally deactivated the network where the self resides. They pulled the plug on the inner critic. Now, I am explaining this from the perspective of someone obsessed with the intersection of philosophy and human performance, but I am absolutely certain there are medical professionals or neuroscientists listening right now who understand the intricate microscopic mechanics of the default mode network far deeper than I do. I would genuinely love to know how you view this deactivation process from a purely clinical standpoint, because the biology here is just staggering. This brings us to one of the most counterintuitive discoveries in modern neuroscience. Dr. Arne Dietrich proposed a theory called transient hypofrontality. Let's break that down. Transient means temporary. Hypo means less or below normal. Frontality refers to the prefrontal cortex. That is the most evolved, logical, and analytical part of your brain. It is the CEO of your mind. Dietrich found that to reach the absolute peak of human potential, to enter that profound flow state, the CEO has to leave the building. The prefrontal cortex must temporarily shut down. You cannot analyze a tennis serve and hit it perfectly at the exact same time. You cannot critique a brushstroke while painting a masterpiece. Defeating Mara doesn't mean fighting him, it means cutting the power to his microphone. When I think about this, I can't help but wonder if the most logical, conscious, highly evolved part of our brain has to literally shut down for us to achieve absolute genius, then who or what is actually executing that genius? If the CEO of the brain is asleep, who is running the company in those moments of pure brilliance? It's a paradox I still struggle to wrap my head around. You can actually trace this biological surrender through the electricity in the brain. Right now, as you go about your stressful day, your brain is firing in beta waves, fast, frantic survival mode. When you sit down, close your eyes, and take a breath, you shift into alpha waves, a relaxed alertness. But as the ego dissolves, as the prefrontal cortex powers down and the DMN goes completely dark, the brain plunges into theta and gamma waves. Gamma waves are the highest frequency brain waves we can measure. They are the signature of intense unitive focus. They bind information across all sensory areas of the brain simultaneously. And here is the haunting part. When we measure the brain waves of a Tibetan monk in the deepest state of Sunyata and an elite extreme athlete in the peak of a death-defying flow state, the electrical signature is identical. They have used the exact same biological backdoor to exit the limitations of the self. They have achieved the ultimate human upgrade by becoming completely empty. But this raises a terrifying and beautiful question. If our human brains operate at their maximum cosmic potential only when we empty out the self, then what exactly are those gamma waves tuning into? We have mapped the architecture of the mind, but what happens when we zoom out, past the skull, past the atmosphere, and look at the architecture of the universe itself?
We have looked inside the dark chamber of the skull. We have seen the biological ego powered down, and we have watched the brain achieve its absolute zenith of power in a state of nothingness. But nature loves a fractal. The micro always reflects the macro. If the human nervous system operates at its highest potential in a state of emptiness, what happens if we zoom out? What happens if we apply that exact same blueprint to the architecture of the universe? If you ask a classical physicist what exists in the dark, silent space between the stars, they will tell you it is a vacuum, empty space, nothing. But if you ask a quantum physicist, the story changes completely. They will tell you about something called the quantum vacuum. They will tell you about zero-point energy. When you remove all matter, heat, light, and radiation from a space, you would expect it to be dead, but it isn't. When physicists look at the absolute void, they find a boiling, chaotic sea of infinite potential energy. Subatomic particles are violently popping in and out of existence in the empty space. In the weird, beautiful world of quantum mechanics, empty space is actually the most energetic state in the universe. Emptiness is the womb of everything. Thinking about this always leaves me standing at the edge of a philosophical cliff. If the fundamental reality of the universe is that emptiness contains infinite energy, then when we empty our minds in the flow state, are we just resting? Or are we literally tapping into the zero-point energy of the cosmos? I can't quite find a definitive answer to that paradox. Does consciousness generate the universe, or does the universe generate consciousness? Thousands of years before we built the Large Hadron Collider to smash particles together, ancient Huayan Buddhist masters described the structure of the cosmos using a staggering metaphor. They called it Indra's net. Imagine an infinite spiderweb expanding across the entire universe, stretching in every direction. At every single intersection of this infinite web, there is a perfectly clear, multifaceted jewel. And if you look closely at any one jewel, you will see the perfect reflection of every other jewel in the entire cosmic web. Every single point contains the whole. Today, theoretical physicists have a different name for Indra's net. They call it quantum entanglement. The agonizingly beautiful, mathematically proven truth that two particles, separated by billions of light years, can instantaneously affect one another. In the ancient Pali canon, the Buddha called this paticca samuppada, dependent origination, the reality that absolutely nothing exists in isolation. You do not exist independently of the trees producing your oxygen, the soil growing your food, or the gravity pinning you to this spinning rock. The only thing in the entire universe that makes you feel separate from the rest of the web is your ego. It is that default mode network we talked about earlier, the biological illusion of I. I am exploring this from the perspective of human performance, philosophy, and history, but I know this touches the absolute bleeding edge of theoretical physics. I am completely certain there are people listening to this who study quantum mechanics or cosmology at a much deeper level than I do. I honestly would love to know how you view the overlap between quantum entanglement and Eastern mysticism. What am I missing from the mathematical side of this equation? Because when you connect the neuroscience of the brain with the physics of the universe, it changes everything about how we view human potential. We have been sold a massive, highly commercialized lie. We have been conditioned to believe that accessing the flow state, entering Jit Wang, is just a Silicon Valley productivity hack, a way to write code faster, to win a gold medal, to close a business deal, or to optimize our morning routines. It is so much bigger than that. When you drop the ego, when your prefrontal cortex goes quiet and you step into the void of the mind, you are not just optimizing your brain. You are cognitively aligning yourself with the fundamental laws of thermodynamics. You are stepping out of the illusion of separation, and you are plugging your nervous system directly into Indra's net. You stop fighting the universe, and for a few fleeting, perfect moments, you allow the universe to operate through you. But if this state of effortless, universal power is our birthright, why is it so incredibly hard to maintain? Why do we constantly fall out of the zone, back into stress, ambition, and suffering?
There is a question that always lingers in the shadows when we talk about this level of deep psychological surrender. It is the unspoken doubt that keeps most highly driven people from ever daring to enter the void. It is the ambition paradox. The voice in your head, that ancient survival mechanism we called Mara, will immediately start whispering to you, "Wait a minute, If I become completely detached, if I let go of my ego and my desires, won't I lose my edge? If I am completely empty, won't I just lose my drive to succeed, to build, to create? Won't I just become a passive observer while the rest of the world passes me by? It is a terrifying thought, especially for anyone who has spent their entire life fighting to climb to the top. But this is where we have to draw a very sharp, very brutal line between two entirely different types of fuel. There is ego-driven ambition, and then there is purpose-driven flow. Ego-driven ambition is what our modern world runs on. It is fueled by desperation, by the fear of not being enough, by the desperate need to prove your worth to people you might not even like. It is loud, it is exhausting, and it has a biological expiration date. If you run your engine on the fear of failure, you will eventually burn out. It is a thermodynamic certainty. If I'm going to lay my cards on the table, I firmly believe that this mainstream method of chasing success, this endless grinding hustle culture from a place of lack, is fundamentally broken. I am absolutely convinced that ego-driven ambition is a guaranteed recipe for misery, no matter how much money it makes you or how much status it brings. But of course, that's just my perspective looking at the sheer volume of burnout in our society. I'm sure some might argue that fear is a necessary motivator to get things off the ground. But let's look at the alternative. Let's look at the people who actually change the world. When you look at the greatest tech innovators, the absolute master architects of our era, or the most legendary artists in human history, when they are in the process of creating their ultimate masterpieces, they are not operating from desperation. They are operating from a space of profound play. When a brilliant programmer is up at 3 in the morning, locked in a flow state, writing lines of elegant code, they aren't thinking about their stock options. When a master painter is blending colors on a canvas, they aren't worried about the critics. They have entered a state of sunyata. The ego is gone. They are completely absorbed in the dance of creation itself. They create not because they need to inflate their identity, but because they are obsessed with the puzzle. They are allowing the universe to express its complexity through their hands. The drive doesn't disappear when the ego vanishes. It actually multiplies. Because you are no longer wasting massive amounts of mental energy protecting your fragile sense of self. When I reflect on my own life, and the times I've tried to force an outcome out of pure ambition and stress, it almost always felt hollow, even if I technically succeeded. But the things I created just for the sheer joy of the work itself, those are the things that resonated the most. It makes me wonder, though, and I'd be genuinely fascinated to hear your take on this. If you think about the single greatest thing you've ever achieved in your life, the moment you are most proud of, were you driven by the anxious need to prove yourself to someone else, or were you completely lost in the joy of the process? I still find myself oscillating between those two states, and I am incredibly curious which fuel you run on when you are at your absolute best. Because the truth is, the void doesn't steal your ambition, it purifies it. It strips away the anxiety and leaves only the raw electric current of pure creation. But if this is true, if the flow state is so pure and powerful, it begs an even dangerous question, a question that blurs the line between human productivity and spiritual awakening. So, if the biological signature is identical, if the brainwaves of a deeply absorbed creator match the brainwaves of a meditating monk, we arrive at a very uncomfortable question. Let's imagine a hacker. It's 2 a.m. They have been locked in a coding flow for 10 straight hours. No food, no concept of time. The ego is completely gone. Their default mode network is powered down, and their brain is bathed in theta and gamma waves. Biologically, neurologically, they are touching the exact same void Siddhartha touched. Does that mean the hacker is enlightened? If an extreme athlete vanishes into the zone while free soloing a mountain, have they achieved nirvana right there on the rock wall? I'll be honest, I wrestled with this specific paradox for a long time. If enlightenment is just a brain state, then anyone with enough adrenaline or focus can hack their way into it. If I had to take a hard stance on it, I would say that the modern world has fundamentally confused a temporary biological hack with actual spiritual liberation. But that is a heavy claim. I often wonder, if a monk and a hacker are experiencing the exact same neurological absence of self, is there actually any difference between them in that specific moment? What do you think really separates them? The answer, it turns out, lies in two words that define the boundary between modern neuroscience and deep spiritual awakening: state and trait. The flow state is exactly that, a state. It is a temporary, highly dependent condition. The hacker is essentially a god while the laptop is open. For those 10 hours, they are completely free from human suffering because they are free from the self. But what happens when the screen goes black? What happens when the mountain climber reaches the summit, the adrenaline fades, and they have to walk back down into normal life? The moment the flow breaks, the ego rushes back in like a flood of cold water. Suddenly, the hacker remembers their past due bills. They remember a bitter argument they had yesterday. They get irrationally angry at the traffic on the way to get coffee. The default mode network reboots. Mara returns to the control room, and the suffering begins all over again. The high performer was merely a tourist in the void. They bought a temporary ticket to Sunyata. This is where the ancient Buddhist blueprint diverges entirely from modern productivity. True awakening is not about visiting the flow state. It is about fundamentally rewiring the nervous system so that the state becomes a permanent trait. An arahat, a fully awakened being, does not need a laptop, a rock wall, or a jazz saxophone to keep the ego quiet. When the arahat closes his eyes, there is absolute peace. But when he opens his eyes, when he walks through a crowded, chaotic, noisy street, the peace remains entirely unbroken. They haven't just muted the inner critic for a few hours, they have dismantled the microphone entirely. The hacker uses the void to escape the world. The master uses the void to live in it. But this incredible neurochemical high of temporary flow, the dopamine, the absolute thrill of disappearing into the work, it carries a hidden danger that very few high performers ever talk about. There is a shadow hanging over everything we have explored so far. A very real, very dangerous trap hidden right at the center of the void. When you enter the flow state, when the ego collapses and the default mode network goes dark, your brain doesn't just go quiet, it rewards you. It unleashes a massive cascading flood of neurochemicals that are, biologically speaking, more potent than most synthetic drugs on Earth. You get hit with dopamine, heightening your focus and drive. Endorphins rush in to kill physical pain. And then there is a very specific rare molecule called anandamide. It is named after the ancient Sanskrit word ananda, which translates to absolute bliss. It is literally the bliss molecule. But here's the terrifying part about neurochemistry. You can become addicted to the absence of your own life. I know this from direct personal experience. There was a period where I was chasing the flow state through my work so aggressively that everything outside of it just felt incredibly dull. Real life, having a normal conversation, paying bills, sitting in traffic, felt like torture. I wasn't using the zone to create anymore. I was using the state of no self to run away from myself. When the flow broke, the crash was agonizing. If you had to describe that exact feeling, that sudden heavy return to normal reality after being completely in the zone, using just one word, for me it would be gravity. Everything suddenly felt heavy again. I'm incredibly curious what word comes to your mind when you think of that crash, because I know I am not the only one who has felt it. In psychology, there is a term for this. It is called spiritual bypassing. It happens when we use highly advanced states of mind, whether it's extreme sports, deep meditation, or 15-hour coding sessions, to bypass our unresolved psychological wounds. The hacker isn't coding to build the future, they're coding because they're terrified of the silence in their apartment. The extreme athlete isn't climbing to conquer the mountain, they're climbing because it is the only way to silence the trauma in their head. They have become dopamine addicts, wearing the mask of a high achiever. They have weaponized emptiness. The ancient Buddhist masters knew about this trap thousands of years before we discovered dopamine. They knew the mind would try to use the bliss of the void as a hiding place. So they engineered a fail-safe, a psychological guardrail to keep you from falling off the edge. They called it sati. In English, we translate it as mindfulness, but that word has been so commercialized it has almost lost its meaning. Sati is the anchor of raw, unfiltered reality. It is the hyper-vigilant awareness of exactly what is happening in the present moment without any desire to escape it. When you have sati, you can enter the bliss of the flow state, but you do not attach to it. You do not crave it when it ends. And when the flow inevitably breaks and you have to return to the messy, chaotic, and painful reality of being a human being, sati is what catches you. Sati allows you to sit with the boredom, anxiety, and the gravity of normal life without needing to flee back into the void. Emptiness without mindfulness is just dissociation. It is just another drug. The true mastery of Jit Wang is realizing that the void was never meant to be a permanent residence. It's a forge. You step into it to burn away the illusions of the ego, to access the infinite potential of the mind, and to realize your entanglement with the universe. But eventually, you have to bring that power back. You have to open your eyes, stand up under the tree, and walk back into the noise of the world.
So how do we actually do this? It is easy to romanticize the ancient world. It is easy to think that if you just packed your bags, left all your responsibilities behind, and found a perfectly quiet cave in the Himalayas, you would finally reach this ultimate state of clarity. But that is a fantasy. You don't need a cave. The modern world, with all its deafening noise, its impossible deadlines, and its absolute chaos, is your monastery. The glowing screen of your laptop, the boardroom, the operating theater, the blank canvas, these are the modern testing grounds. They are the exact same psychological battlefields that Siddhartha faced in the jungle. We just need to translate that ancient technology into a biological framework you can use tomorrow morning. Think of this as the Sunyata protocol. It happens in 4 highly specific, unforgiving stages. Step 1 is focus. In the ancient texts, they called this dharana. In modern neurology, this is the harnessing of your beta waves. You have to give the brain a target. You set one clear, undeniable goal. You close every other tab. You put the phone in another room. You strip away all escape routes until there is only you and the task. Then comes step 2, the struggle. This is the exact moment where 99% of people fail. You sit down to do the deep work, and suddenly every single cell in your biological vessel wants to do something else. Your brain screams for cheap dopamine. You feel an overwhelming urge to check your email, to get a snack, to just look away for 1 second. This is Mara. This is the neurological friction of your default mode network fighting for its very survival. It is the ego refusing to be quiet. Let me be completely honest with you here, because this is a daily war for me. Whenever I sit down to synthesize these massive, complex concepts, the first 20 minutes are pure, unadulterated agony. My brain begs me to stop. I have to physically force myself to stay in the chair. I am absolutely certain I am not alone in this. If you are listening to this right now, I want you to think about that exact moment of friction right before you break through into your absolute best work. If you had to describe that specific feeling of mental resistance using just one single word, what would it be? For me, the word is suffocation. It is always fascinating to me how different minds process that exact same wall of resistance. Because if you can survive that suffocation without surrendering to the distraction, something deeply profound happens. You enter step 3, the release. You stop forcing the outcome. You stop fighting the friction. You simply accept the struggle. And by accepting it, the ego suddenly realizes it has no enemy left to fight.
This is where transient hypofrontality kicks in. The prefrontal cortex, the CEO of your brain, quietly leaves the building. You let go of the desperate need to be brilliant. You surrender the I, which drops you instantly into step 4, samadhi, flow, the void. The work begins to happen on its own. The friction completely vanishes. Time distorts. You are no longer the one typing the code, writing the music, or solving the equation. You have become a pure conduit. It is execution without the executor. The masterpiece is painting itself. But there is a brutal physical catch to this entire process. You cannot run high-level cosmic software on broken biological hardware. Entering the void requires an immense amount of physiological energy. You cannot force the default mode network to power down if your nervous system is chronically inflamed. If you are surviving on 4 hours of fragmented sleep, running your engine on processed sugar, and flooding your brain with endless dopamine by staring at a glowing rectangle every 3 minutes, your prefrontal cortex is completely exhausted. It is physically incapable of making the leap into the void. This is why the ancient monks had such strict codes of physical conduct. Diet, deep sleep, and what we now call digital minimalism are not just trendy health hacks. They are the absolute biological prerequisites for cognitive mastery. You have to fiercely protect the vessel because a fried nervous system can never access the silent depths of the mind.
Let's go back to where this all started. The humid jungle. The riverbank. The long night has finally passed. The psychological war with Mara, the frantic firing of the survival instincts, the desperate screams of the ego, it has all faded into absolute silence. The storm is over. Dawn is breaking. Siddhartha slowly opens his eyes. He hasn't acquired anything new. He hasn't gained a weapon to defeat his enemies or a shield to protect his pride. But as he looks out at the morning light, he understands something that will fundamentally shift the course of human history. Ultimate power, the kind of genius that bends reality, does not come from conquering the world. It comes entirely from conquering the illusion of the self. When I sit with that realization, it forces me to look at my own life. We all carry this incredibly heavy psychological armor every single day. If you had to strip it all down right now, if you had to leave just one single word that describes the heaviest part of your ego, the one thing you know you desperately need to drop to reach your highest potential, what would that word be? For me, it is the word control. Letting go of that illusion of control is terrifying for me. It is truly fascinating to think about what that specific word might be for each of you. Because dropping that weight is the only price of admission to the void. When you finally let it go, when you enter Jit Wang, you are not becoming nothing. You are not erasing your existence or stepping into a dark, empty room. You are simply, finally, getting out of your own way. You are clearing the channel. You are taking the fragile, anxious concept of I and dissolving it, allowing the infinite, entangled potential of the universe to express itself flawlessly through your mind and your hands. In that state of perfect emptiness, there is no more separation between you and the work. There is no more friction. You are no longer the dancer. You become the dance itself. May you all progress in the Dhamma. We look forward to seeing you on the next occasion. Goodbye.